Some of the most remarkable people that I've ever met, and actually some of the most remarkable people that many of you have ever met, are people that we could describe this way. They're the believe in spite of people. You ever met a believe in spite of person? They're going through difficult circumstances, like financially or with their health or with the health of somebody that they love, or they're going through a divorce or they've lost their job, but they're going through some really tough stuff. And yet, in the midst of all of that, their confidence in God is unshakable. Like you watch them and you realize they still have joy, and they still have peace, and they still have optimism about the future. They just exude what the Apostle Paul described as peace that surpasses understanding, which means given their circumstances and all that's going on with them, it doesn't really make sense. And so you watch them and you wonder, are they in denial? But they're not. They just trust God, and they live in a way that's inspiring. In fact, some of you, a big reason that you're here today and a big reason that you came to believe in Jesus is that a person like this was deeply impactful to you at some point along the way in your journey, in your life. Maybe it was your grandpa or your grandma, maybe your mom, maybe your dad, maybe a coworker or a friend or a neighbor. But you watched them in their life walk through horrendous circumstances. I mean, the kind of circumstances that would level most people. You watched them walk through fire, and yet they had faith and they had peace. And you watched it, and it made you curious, and it inspired you. And you kind of thought, wow, like, as you watch them, you kind of go, I don't have that. I don't have that, but I want that. Because I don't really have any peace, and I don't really have much confidence. And like, the future just scares me to death. Death scares me to death. And this person, in spite of their incredibly difficult circumstances, they're walking through this, and they're just fine. And I want to become the sort of person that would be fine if I was walking through that kind of thing. Because when we meet people that are walking through fire, we often look at them and we wonder, like we project, right? And we ask ourselves, how would I handle it? Okay, how would I handle it if I were going through what they're going through? And when you meet one of these believe in spite of people, it's just like you look at them and it's just like, wow, like that's amazing. Last week we started this 7-part series called The 7 Signs. And we addressed a problem that often arises in around Christianity. Possibly the two most misused and misunderstood words when it comes to all of religion and specifically to Christianity are these two words, okay? Faith and believe. Now, when these words are used outside of a religious context, we all know what they mean. And what we do is we believe, okay, or we have faith in something based on what? Evidence. I mean, in the realm of science or in politics or sports or whether we're judging someone's character or, that kind of stuff, what we decide, we decide what we believe based on evidence, what we see, what we hear, maybe what we read. But one of the things that I want us to see throughout this series is this. The words faith and believe were not intended to take on special meaning when they're suddenly dropped into the context of Christianity. And yet often in our culture, religious faith and belief are divorced or thought to be divorced from reason. And we've all seen this. In the context of religion, faith and belief suddenly take on this new meaning. They take on a life of their own that's just like completely separate from and divorced from reason. And some of you grew up in contexts like this. And you grew up hearing stuff like, well, you just have to believe, right? Or you just have to take it by faith. But when you think of it, like outside of a religious context, we just would never say that kind of thing. Because you either believe something or you don't based on evidence, because there's a reason to. If there's a lack of evidence for something, why believe it? And if there's a lot of evidence, well, then of course we're going to believe it. And this is how faith and belief work in every other context. And here's what I hope us to see through, I hope that we'll see throughout the course of this series. Okay, John, the disciple John, who wrote the Gospel of John, if he were to hear people say, hey, you just have to believe, or hey, man, you just gotta take it by faith, he would say, no, you don't. That's not how this works. And Peter and Mark and Matthew and the other disciples would say the same. You just have to take it by faith? Like, really? You just have to believe? Really? Because when you think about it, the disciples didn't just take it by faith. They believed because of what? Because of evidence. Yeah, they believed because of what they saw. They came to believe because of what they saw and what they heard. And then they went out and they told their story. Now, I want to come back to a critical idea for Christian faith that we touched on last week, which is we believe stuff based on confidence in the person delivering the information, right? I mean, anything that we believe that we haven't experienced firsthand, and there's a whole lot of that stuff for all of us, we believe based on information or testimony from others. We believe things about science because scientists tell us that's how it is. We believe things about history even though we weren't there. Why? Because other people that we think are trustworthy have told us what's happened. We believe these things because we assume these people are credible. And that leads us to a huge question regarding Christian faith. How trustworthy were the eyewitnesses of Jesus? Like, this is a really big deal when it comes to our faith. Like, did they actually see and hear what they claim to have seen and heard? And if you weren't here last week, I just want to encourage you to check out last week's message. Because it was the first message of kind of this longer series, and it really lays the foundation for what we're going to be doing in this series. But part of what we did last week is we talked a little bit about the trustworthiness of the disciples. Like, when it comes to Christian faith, this is a really big deal. And if you're here and you go, I was here last week, are we doing the same thing? We're not. I'm not going to talk about that again. But if you weren't here, I would encourage you to go and check that out. And it's just on our website at brookviewchurch.com. You click on messages, and it'll take you to everything that we've done over the last few years. So this series is based on eyewitness testimony about Jesus. That's what this whole series is about. It's about eyewitness testimony about Jesus, and the eyewitness is the disciple John. Okay, one of the original 12. The Gospel of John is the story of Jesus as told by John. And John organizes the story around 7 miracles, or what John calls 7 signs. And last week we looked at the first sign, okay, Jesus turning water into wine. And then after that event, John tells us that Jesus went down to Jerusalem and he did a lot more stuff. John tells us this. He says, no, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. Okay, so Jesus turns the water into wine at the wedding in Cana, and then he goes to Jerusalem and he performs all of these miracles, all these signs. And then after Jerusalem, Jesus did some more traveling, and that's where we pick this up. So here we go. John chapter 4, verse 46, it says, once more he visited Cana in Galilee. And if the reader's going, well, that sounds familiar, he tells us why. He says, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. Okay, so Jesus left Cana, where he turned water into wine, and then he went down to Jerusalem, and he performed all of these miracles and all of these signs, and he did all of this ministry, and now he's returned to Cana. Well, in Cana, a man described as a royal official comes to see Jesus. Now, this man has traveled a long, long way to get to Jesus. We're told that he's from Capernaum, which would have been about an 8-hour walk from Cana. So if he came by horse, and this guy's wealthy, so maybe he did by horse or chariot, it was still 3 hours. Okay, it was a long, long way. And the reason he traveled all that way is because his son was very sick. So John continues. He said, when this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come, okay, back to his hometown, an 8-hour walk away, and heal his son, who was close to death. Now, try to put yourself in the place of this man for a second. I mean, those of you that are parents, can you imagine what he was going through? For me, I go, I'm not sure I really can, because I just can't imagine one of my kids getting sick and dying. I can't imagine losing one of my kids. Our daughter, Kate, is going to be a junior in college this fall. And when she was just finishing 8th grade, like spring of 8th grade, we had a big scare with her. Kate was invited to play basketball with the high school varsity team, and they were playing in a tournament with much older girls than her. And Kate was dribbling the ball up the court full speed, and she collided with a senior girl from the other team who was a lot bigger and stronger than she was. And it was kind of like a Mack truck hitting a motorcycle. And so the senior girl, when she came in like arms and legs flying, and she kneed Kate right in the thigh. And it knocked Kate out of the game. I mean, she was on the ground, just laid out for several minutes and screaming in pain. So she sat out the rest of the game, and then we tried to get her in the car on the way home, but we could hardly get her in the car because she couldn't bend her leg. It was just like locked straight, and every time she tried to bend it, she was just screaming in pain. And so Jen and I are like, we've seen Charlie horses before. This is like the worst Charlie horse we've ever seen. So we decided maybe we should take her to the ER and just make sure that nothing's broken. So we went to the ER, they did the x-rays, and the doctor came in and talked to us. And she said, hey, there's no fracture, so that's good news. But we're seeing something else that's really a concern. So you should schedule her for an MRI down at Children's Hospital as soon as you possibly can. And the doctor had this like really serious tone in what she was saying. But she wouldn't be specific about what she saw on the x-ray. She just kept saying, well, there's an abnormality that's unrelated to her injury that deserves a closer look. Now, we know that like you don't schedule MRIs on a whim. They're expensive. It usually takes a long time to get one. And this was a Friday night, and they wanted us to get one like Monday. So Monday morning at like 7, we got a call from the nurse of our family doctor. So the family doctor reached out to us because over the weekend, this emergency room staff had sent them an x-ray and the report of what they thought was going on. And so she let us know that they had actually already scheduled, they wanted to get right on this and get us scheduled right away. They had already called Children's and already scheduled an MRI for us. The earliest we could get in was Tuesday, but they wanted to know, could we come in and could she meet with her family doctor as soon as possible on Monday morning? So the nurse is talking to Jen about all of this, and she happened to be someone that I went to high school with, and her husband was one of our kids' basketball coaches, so we knew her pretty well. And before she hung up, she's talking to Jen, and she just said, after getting all the details worked out, she's like, oh man, how are you guys doing? I mean, I saw the report and just couldn't believe that this was sweet Kate. So we just want you to know we're going to do everything that we can to get you the best care available. I'm so sorry. How are you guys taking all this? Are you doing okay? Now, it was weird because everyone was talking like this, right? And we don't even know what's going on. We're like, what are you even talking about? So we took Kate into her pediatrician later that morning on Monday, and she looked at the x-ray, and she read the report, and she too was super vague about what was happening. So we said, hey, Kate, why don't you head out to the lobby? We're just going to talk to your doctor real quick. And we said, okay, what's going on? Why is everything so rushed, and why is everything so serious? And she said, well, it could turn out to be nothing, but it sure looks like she has a bone tumor. And I said, all right, okay, well, hopefully it's nothing. But if it is a tumor, what then? And she said, well, then they will want to admit Kate right away and do surgery right away. And then it will probably be radiation and chemo to follow. And that could all happen like this week. And so we looked back at her and we nodded and we smiled. And she was like, wow. You guys seem to be doing like really well with this. And we told her that over the weekend we had talked about this and we thought that maybe it was something like this. And we just decided, you know what, we're not going to, we're going to assume that it's nothing until we know for sure. Because worrying and starting to think about worst case scenarios, that isn't going to help anything, right? And Kate doesn't need to know anything except she needs an MRI. And we don't want her to see us panicking and for that to scare her, so we're just going to play it cool. Okay, so the next day, on Tuesday, we got the MRI, and they scheduled us immediately for a follow-up on Wednesday to discuss it. And they scheduled that follow-up with an orthopedic surgeon. So obviously, they were thinking surgery. And everything was just happening so fast, and it was all being rushed through like this was really life and death, top priority, which was like nice that they were rushing it, but it was frightening. Now, like I said, we decided not to let ourselves overthink this and dive into all the worst case scenarios. And honestly, we did a pretty good job. But it was there, and so we just sort of forced it out of our minds. But we felt like, okay, we should let like our immediate, like parents know what's going on. So Jen called her parents, and I called my dad. And I remember being on the phone and explaining to my dad, they're probably, okay, Dad, here's what's going to happen. They're probably going to do surgery, and then we'll start radiation and chemo later this week. And my dad just said, oh my. And that's it. And for some reason, and I don't know if this ever happens to you, but you can like be totally okay with stuff, like you're coping and you're dealing, and then you hear a familiar voice. And so something just snapped in me, and I kind of lost it. I just like couldn't push it away, and I realized, oh my gosh, this is like really serious. We could lose our little girl. Now, this kind of stuff happens to families all the time, right? Like kids get cancer, and they die sometimes, and suddenly the weight of all of this hit me, and I just was having a really hard time shaking it. And so I choked up a little with my dad, and then when we hung up, I just like lost it. Had a 10-minute breakdown, and then I was like, okay, pulled it back together. Now, as some of you have realized, because I said it earlier, Kate was in 8th grade, and she's now a junior in college. Obviously, this all turned out okay. The ortho surgeon at Children's looked at the MRI, but he also looked at the original X-ray, and he said, I don't even know why we're here. He said, this abnormality is nothing, and he started bagging on he's like, a base level X-ray tech should be able to tell that this is nothing. He's like, this is just a normal bone cyst, and you can see right here that it's already healing on its own. And I'm like, oh, obviously it's healing. I mean, what an idiot. They should have showed me in the first place. But he's like, the trauma from the collision, he's like, he's looking at the MRI, he's like, this is the worst hematoma I have ever seen. The tissue damage, okay, in her quad is unreal. I'm actually shocked that with this much damage, her femur didn't snap in half. So you're really lucky. This is like, the tissue damage is bad, but cancer, no. Not at all. This is just a normal bone cyst. It's healing. It's going to be no problem. It'll go away on its own. And he said, and I'm really sorry that for the last few days, you guys have been on this roller coaster. Okay, so for us, crisis averted. But I will tell you what, for 5 days or so, it just rocked our world. Now, back to the guy in our story. His son is laying in bed with a deadly fever. And the medical people in the palace, they know. This is not the kind of thing that people recover from. He's a very powerful, very wealthy guy. He's a royal official, we're told. And scholars believe that he was probably a high-ranking official to King Herod. So this guy is resourced, and he's used to getting his way. But when it comes to the health of his son, he's finding himself completely helpless. He has come to the end of himself. And I think that we've all been there in some way at some time of our lives. And my guess is that some of you may be there this morning. Maybe you got up this morning and you got yourself here and you did your best to put on your happy face. But underneath all of it, like behind the surface, something is going on in your life, and it's a problem for you that is all-consuming, and you are helpless to fix it. Maybe you're here this morning, and right now your marriage is a mess, and maybe you don't know where it went wrong. Like it hasn't always been this way, or you would not have married this person. But you just aren't connecting anymore. And there's tension a lot of the time, and you've tried everything you know, and you're just like, you're at the end of yourself. Or maybe you're here and your struggle is faith. Like you find yourself filled with all kinds of doubts, and you don't feel very solid about what you believe. Maybe it once felt solid, or maybe it never has, but you don't have a solid ground to put your feet on. Or maybe it's your kids. You see them struggling. They're struggling with something, and you want them to thrive. You just want them to thrive, but they're not. And you want to step in and fix it, but you can't. You're just watching them struggle and struggle and struggle. And it's so hard, and you can't fix it. Or maybe you've got other issues in your family. Maybe things in somewhere are a mess, and there's anger and hurt everywhere, just like brokenness and dysfunction that's just like escalating. You're watching adults act like children, and you can't fix it. Or maybe you've got financial issues. You look at your bills, and then you think about your income, and there's just no way it can work. And the stress is crushing you, and you're coming to the end of yourself. I don't know what might be happening with you these days, but there are times for all of us when we come to the end of ourselves. Well, this man finds himself in that situation. His son is hanging on for dear life. All the resources at his disposal have fallen short. He is broken, he's helpless, he's desperate. He has come to the end of himself. And yet, here's what's interesting to me about this. While his son is on the verge of death, with who knows how long before it could all be over, he leaves to go get Jesus. Now, when you think about it, he's a rich, powerful guy. Why didn't he just send his servants to get Jesus? Well, I have a theory. This is total speculation, okay? So don't run too far with this, but here's what I think happened. By this time, there were all kinds of stories circulating all over about Jesus. And when his wife heard that Jesus had come into the region, she said to her husband, very sternly, "You go get him, and you bring him here." And the husband was like, "But our son is dying. When I get back, our son may be dead." But his wife wouldn't budge. She said, "You go down there, and you get that man, and you bring him back here." And so this husband had to make the decision. Do I leave my dying son knowing that I may never see him again, or should I just send a servant? Because seriously, these are just rumors about this supposed miracle worker. But he decides to go himself. He decides to go himself and to plead with Jesus to come. Now, the word translated begged in Greek was an ongoing tense word. So the idea was that he was pleading with Jesus like over and over and over and over. Like he's just fallen down and he is just pleading and pleading with Jesus. So forget dignity, forget about his position, forget about his status in society. He's just like, my son is dying, and if you can help me, that will, what will it take to get you by my son's bedside? And some of you have been there too, right? I mean, some of you, when you think about your prayer life, the first prayers you ever prayed were just prayers of utter desperation. You didn't know what to do, but you knew you needed help. So maybe your prayer just kind of went something like this. To whom it may concern, I don't know if anybody's out there, but if anybody's out there, I need help, and I need it in a big way, and I need it now. Now, Jesus' response to all this pleading and begging seems really odd and insensitive. He says, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe. And doesn't it, I don't know, for me, it doesn't feel like geez, Jesus. Have a little empathy. That's so rude. But I think Jesus really is mostly talking to the crowd that's listening in. Because many of them have come really for the wrong reasons. They just want to see miracles. They just want to see signs. They just want to be entertained. So Jesus addresses them through this man. And of course, the royal official is like, yeah, whatever. And he leans in and he says, Sir, please come down before my child dies. And the level of humility on display here is staggering, because you have to remember, this man is a high-ranking official, and yet he comes to Jesus, someone way below him on the social ladder, and he falls down before him, and he calls him Sir. And this powerful man humbles himself before Jesus, and he just pleads. And the word that he uses for child or for son, for the person that he's talking about, changes here. It isn't just my son any longer. He says, my child. And here it becomes much more tender. Here it becomes much more heartfelt language. It's not just my son. It's like the word that he's using is just like my little guy. He's like, my little guy. It's like he's saying, please, sir, please come. You have to come. Please come with me before my little guy dies. And even though in society this man is way above Jesus, in this moment he lowers himself. And he doesn't care. He's like, I know people watching this are appalled. I know my servants and my close friends who traveled here with me are embarrassed by how small I've become. But sir, would you please come with me? He's so desperate. And yet, and this is what's kind of surprising about all of this, that at the same time, he's desperate, but at the same time, he's confident. I mean, he's really confident. He's so confident that if I could just get this rabbi to my son's bedside, I think my son would be okay. If I could just get this man, this rabbi, to my son's bedside, I think everything would be okay. And you go, well, why is he so confident? Why did he make this trip? Why risk losing those last moments with your son? Why leave your wife all alone to take care of this without you? And it's simple. Because there were rumors of a son of man, stories of a savior. There had been insane stories about this man doing insane things. And so he wonders, what if these stories are true? And in his mind, really, there's only two options. Either Jesus comes with me, or he doesn't. If Jesus comes with me, then maybe my son could be healed. Or if Jesus refuses to come, then my son will die. There's two options. But Jesus looks and Jesus smiles because Jesus knows there's a third option. And Jesus asked him to do what Jesus has been asking people to do ever since. Jesus asked this royal official to trust him based on the testimony of other people. He asked him to entrust his son to him based on the stories that were told to him about Jesus by other people. Jesus turns to the royal official and he says, go. In fact, the Greek word translated go kind of carries this idea. It's like, just go about your business. Just carry on. Just go about your business. Go, Jesus replied. Your son will live. Now, come on. I mean, dads, if you're dad, right, this is you. Can you imagine this? You want me to head on home without you? Pardon me, but you haven't met my wife. Okay? If I go home without you, there may be 2 deaths in our family. So he's like, wait. There are 2 categories. You come with me and my son lives, or you don't come and my son dies. You're saying you're not coming and my son will live. Like, seriously? You're telling me to just go on about my business? And I wonder, I don't know, maybe this is me because I'm a control freak, but I wonder if the man looks at his bodyguards that came with him, that traveled down with him, and he thinks, well, maybe we could just take him by force. I mean, his disciples are pretty puny. I think we could take him. And my son's life is at stake. And you just want me to do like a little shopping, Jesus? Just buy some flowers for the missus and maybe wait until the sun goes down and it's not so hot and we can travel in comfort, and then we just kind of meander back home without you. And guys, I just want to say, this is where we all live, right? This is where we all live, right here. This is where we live. And this is why I think these stories and John choosing these specific stories is so brilliant. These are not just random acts of kindness. This is Jesus painting a picture, like laying a path that people have been walking for 2,000 years. It's the path that many of you have walked or are walking or maybe will walk in the future. This story is a lifetime like reduced to a day. This is your lifetime and my lifetime just reduced to a day. We're asked to take Jesus at his word based on the word of other people. We're asked to entrust our lives to Jesus. We're asked to entrust our health to Jesus. We're asked to trust our future to Jesus, our children to Jesus, our eternity to Jesus, based on the words of people who knew him and saw him. And we are to go about our business, even with our unanswered prayers, even when we make requests and Jesus says no, confident that there's something to this man, Jesus, that he is, in fact, who he claimed and demonstrated himself to be. Now, as I said earlier, we've all seen people do this, haven't we? They just carry unanswered prayer, these burdens that won't go away, sicknesses that won't be healed, financial situations that won't turn around, spouses who will never come home, kids who will never come home, parents who act like children. Now, we've seen people carry this stuff, and yet when you watch them, you go, oh my goodness, I don't know how, but there's still joy there. There's still peace there. There's still confidence there. And we see these people, we watch them, and it's intimidating, and yet it's also inspiring. And for some of you, it's part of how you came to faith. And here's what it means for the rest of us who follow Jesus, who say, I am a follower of Jesus. When you have that unanswered prayer, when you have that thing going on and it's not getting better, but you keep seeking Jesus and you keep loving people and you remain faithful, and every once in a while you pause and you wonder, like, okay, God, where are you? Like, where are you, God? But you keep seeking him and serving him and remaining faithful. Do you know who's watching you live that out? No, you don't. You don't. Do you know what God is doing in other people's lives and in other people's hearts because of you? No, you don't. You don't see it. Do you know who's maybe a month or a year or 5 years away from putting their faith in Jesus because of you? No, you don't. And this story is like our life condensed to a day. We're invited to take Jesus at his word because of his words to others. And so the royal official has abandoned all dignity to beg Jesus to come with him. And he's not getting what he came for. He's not getting who he came for. And yet he makes a decision. He makes the decision that people have been making for 2,000 years. It's the decision that can change the trajectory of a life. And maybe if you were to make this decision, it would change your life. Here's what he did. It says, the man took Jesus at his word and departed. So he believed what Jesus said, and then he behaved as if Jesus could be trusted. And so imagine it. He walked away from the only person who could save his son. He left without Jesus because he decided to trust Jesus. To use an old Christian phrase, he walked home by faith and not by sight. Now, some of you have been walking this way for years, right? And again, it's just a lifetime condensed to a day. It says, well, he was still on the way, wondering what he would face when he got home. His servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, yesterday at 1 PM, the fever left him. and chills run down his spine and tears fill his eyes. Because then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." So he rushes the rest of the way home, and he flings open the door, and he sees his wife, and she says, "You're never going to believe it." But for some reason, he doesn't really look all that surprised. And she looks around and asks, "Okay, where's the rabbi?" And so he tells his wife the story, this incredibly profound story. And John says, so he and his whole household believed. Now, this is not suggesting that this man was like inspired for the afternoon. The idea here is that this event forever changed his relationship to Jesus. He became a believer. He had limited information about Jesus. This is before the cross and before the resurrection. The information available to him was limited, but there was no limit to his love for Jesus. He gave Jesus his whole heart, and so did his family. And for the rest of his life, that moment in Cana was the turning point. It was the hinge point. The man who had political power over Jesus humbled himself, and he made a request, and Jesus responded, and he never forgot. And again in his life, because you would imagine he had other kids, and he had other people that he loved, and eventually they died. Jesus didn't heal everybody. He faced suffering, he faced pain, he faced all of that. He believed, and he believed, and he believed. Why? Because he would go back time and time again to that moment in Cana that was undeniable. And John concludes the story with this. He says, this was the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee. And I just want to close this morning by addressing those of you that have walked with Jesus for a while. Those of you that have met with Jesus. You've encountered him and you've seen him move in your life. At one time, you were in a crisis of some kind, and you were at the end of yourself. Maybe you were single and you asked Jesus to move, and now you're sitting by somebody. You were depressed and you asked Jesus to move. Didn't feel like there was a way out of it, but you asked Jesus to move. Or you had no child and you asked Jesus to move. Or you had no job and you asked Jesus to move. Your faith was falling apart and you asked Jesus to move. Or you were lonely and struggling and you asked Jesus to move. And he did. And now you're living in a new reality. But it's easy to take where we are for granted. To forget that where we are is actually a miracle, that God has done something, that there's been an answer to prayer. And when we forget about the faithfulness of God, we lose faith. And that's why we need to go back to the miracles God has already done in our lives and remember and remember and remember. When you lose your way or you lose faith or when you come to the end of yourself, yet again, you need to go back to the Canas of your life. For some of you, that means you need to go back to that moment in the hospital. You need to go back to that day that you met your spouse. You need to go back to that period that you prayed for God to give you a child. You need to go back to the day that you got the job, back to the day that God broke through with your doubt. You need to go back to Cana and let what he's already done remind you of what he can do. And once again, be willing to pursue him relentlessly, to set aside pride, to set aside dignity, and fall at his feet. I mean, just because you journeyed once doesn't mean that the journey is over. There may be a new journey for you. There may be a new journey. Are you willing to go again? Are you willing to do this again? Because if you are one of those believe in spite of people, you never know who's watching. You never know what effect it's having. You never know the way God might be using you. Your faith may inspire others to eternity-changing faith as well.